A wealthy CEO chuckled when a young girl, barely 8, claimed she could repair his Mustang. He never imagined she'd dismantle his whole company and construct it anew, stronger. Richard Miller shouldn't have been there. Detroit's run-down edges, with their decaying warehouses and abandoned repair shops, were worlds away from his sleek, high-rise office on the 40th floor. His driver had made a wrong turn, and instead of lingering in his plush car, Richard, out of intrigue or restlessness, chose to wander. The garage he stepped into was a relic of its former self, worn by time. Peeling signs, corroded tools, and the faint odor of aged oil hung in the air. But it wasn't the place that grabbed his attention. It was the tiny figure hunched over a Mustang's engine. A girl, perhaps 7 or 8, balanced on a wooden box, her arms buried deep in the car's motor. She was small, with untidy blonde hair pulled into a loose braid, her grey t-shirt stained with oil, her oversized red coveralls faded from use. Her face was intent, lips pressed tight as her small hands wielded a wrench with skill beyond her age. Richard leaned against the garage's entrance, intrigued. "You working on that old car, kid?" he asked, his voice half teasing, half curious. The girl didn't glance up. "I'm not a kid. I'm a mechanic," she stated plainly, securing a bolt with a firm click. He couldn't resist a laugh. "Really? All right, little mechanic. Fix that Mustang, and it's yours." He spoke without thought, another bold promise from a man used to unchallenged authority. He'd made such offers to seasoned men who buckled under pressure. But this, a skinny girl in a grimy garage, no chance. She finally looked up, and when their eyes locked, something in Richard wavered. Her stare was piercing, ice blue and steady. She wasn't joking. "Deal," she said simply, returning to the engine. An elderly man emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. His hair was grey, his frame bent, but his eyes echoed the girl's, calm, sharp. "She'll make you keep that promise, sir," he said as he passed, his voice neutral, stating a fact. Richard lingered, standing casually, though his grin faded as he observed the girl work. She wasn't clumsy or guessing. Each tool she grabbed had intent. Every tweak was exact. He glanced at his watch. 20 minutes passed, 30, then an hour. The girl never lost her focus. The garage rang with a rumble when she finally turned the key. The Mustang's engine, which seemed like a lifeless husk when Richard arrived, roared to life with a rich, deep growl. It was flawless, beyond flawless. Emma, she said her name only after cleaning her hands on a rag, stepped back from the car, her face smudged with oil but shining with pride. "You owe me a Mustang," she said. For the first time in years, Richard Miller was at a loss for words. He wasn't a man easily awed, yet here he was, outdone by an 8-year-old in a dilapidated garage. A mix of respect and unease stirred within him. He reached for his wallet, but Emma shook her head. "Not cash. You said the car." The old man, Frank, watched from the doorway, a faint smile on his lips. Richard had no option. He tossed the keys to Emma, who caught them with a grin. It could have ended there, a quirky tale for the next board meeting. But Richard stayed. He couldn't leave. Something about that girl, that place, held him. And for a reason he couldn't yet pinpoint, he knew this wasn't the last he'd see of Emma Blake. It was only the start. The next morning, Richard Miller found himself back at that same garage, parked in his glossy black sedan, staring at the worn building through the windshield. He wasn't sure why he'd returned. Millionaire CEOs didn't typically revisit rundown auto shops after making reckless promises. But something from the day before gripped him. He watched as Emma, still in her grey t-shirt and red coveralls, opened the garage door. She didn't see him. She was too busy pulling a heavy toolbox toward the Mustang. It was hers now. Richard had left the title on the workbench, assuming she wouldn't know what to do with it. Yet there she was, up early, ready to work, as if owning a classic car at 8 was perfectly ordinary. Richard stepped out of his car, adjusting his cufflinks more from habit than need. The sound of his costly Italian shoes on gravel caught Emma's attention. She looked up, unimpressed. "You're back," she said, not questioning. He smiled, unsure how to justify his presence. "Couldn't sleep. That Mustang of yours kept me up. Emma wiped her hands on a cloth, eyeing him warily. Worried I'll wreck it? Not exactly, Richard replied. I'm more concerned you'll rebuild it better than my whole engineering team. She tilted her head as if deciding whether he was joking. Then she shrugged. Maybe. Frank appeared from inside, holding 2 mugs of coffee, one of which he silently offered to Richard. The gesture was simple, but Richard understood. You're welcome, but don't waste our time. They sat on overturned crates while Emma worked, the air filled with the soft clink of tools. Richard noticed how Frank watched his granddaughter, not with worry, but with quiet pride. She didn't need oversight. She was in her zone. You taught her? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Frank shook his head. Emma doesn't get taught. She listens, she learns, then she does it her way. It was humbling. Richard, a man who led boardrooms and sealed billion-dollar deals, sat quietly as an 8-year-old took apart and rebuilt one of the most iconic cars ever made. Every move she made was deliberate, no guesswork, no hesitation. As the afternoon sun streamed through the garage's cracked windows, Emma slid out from under the car, wiped sweat from her brow, and gestured to Richard. Want to see something? She asked. He followed her to the Mustang. She lifted the hood and pointed to a section of the engine she'd reworked. It wasn't just repaired, it was enhanced. It wasn't flowing right. Too constricted, she explained. I opened it up. It'll run smoother now. Richard was speechless again. She wasn't reciting a manual. She understood the machine, sensed its flaws, and fixed them with an intuition no corporate training could match. You don't know who I am, do you? He asked suddenly. Emma wiped her hands again, clearly unbothered. You're the guy who gave me a Mustang. That's all I care about. It stung his ego, but in a strangely refreshing way. Here, in this small garage, his titles meant nothing. Emma cared about the engine's hum, the gear's alignment, the way a machine should feel. For the first time in years, Richard felt small, not diminished, but in the way a man feels when he realizes the world is bigger than his office, that genius isn't confined to corporate towers. As he watched Emma slide back under the Mustang, humming softly, Richard knew with certainty he'd witnessed something extraordinary. Leaving wasn't an option anymore. Richard Miller wasn't one to pry into people's lives. He dealt in contracts, figures, and sleek presentations, not tales of hardship and resilience. Yet, after 2 afternoons in that crumbling garage, curiosity tugged at him. He needed to know how a little girl like Emma Blake mastered machines in a place the world had forgotten. He arrived earlier this time, bringing a box of pastries and 2 large coffees, a clumsy attempt at courtesy his PR team would have mocked. To his surprise, Frank accepted them with a nod, as if he'd anticipated it. Emma barely noticed, already deep in her work, her small hands smudged with oil before the sun was fully up. Frank gestured to a worn bench at the back of the garage. They sat, the air thick with gasoline and rust, as Emma's soft humming filled the space. For a while they were silent, only the sound of wrenches turning and tools clinking breaking the quiet. She's been here since she was 4, Frank said at last, his voice low, steady. After the accident. Richard listened, not interrupting. He knew this story didn't need questions. My daughter Lily and her husband Mark were mechanics, not the shiny dealership kind, the real kind. They brought Emma here on weekends. She'd sit on the workbench playing with bolts and sockets like toys. One night, a drunk driver hit them head on. Emma was supposed to be in that car, but she had a fever, so I kept her here. Frank's hands shook slightly as he sipped his coffee. His eyes stayed on Emma, who was focused on reviving the Mustang, unaware of their heavy conversation. After that, we barely got by. I couldn't afford to fix this place or compete with city shops. But Emma kept coming every morning, saying the cars needed her. Richard felt a lump in his throat, a rare discomfort. He glanced around the garage, noticing Emma's world, tiny handprints on the tool chest, a child's drawing of a Mustang taped to the wall, sockets arranged not by size but by use. You could have sought help, Richard said, the words feeling empty as they left his lips. Frank gave a dry chuckle. From who? City charities. They don't fund old men with greasy hands, and Emma didn't want pity. She wanted engines. Richard understood. He saw it clearly now. Emma wasn't a hobbyist. She was surviving. Every bolt she tightened kept her parents' memory alive. Every car she fixed was her refusal to be forgotten like their shop. But what struck Richard most was her drive to create. She didn't fix the Mustang just for a dare. She did it because machines were where her world made sense. As the afternoon faded, Emma called out, her voice light. "Mr. Miller, want to see her run again?" Richard approached as she turned the key. The engine purred, smoother than the day before. Emma's face glowed, proud but calm, as if she'd always known the result. "She's not just fixed," Emma said. "She's better." Richard looked at Frank, who gave a quiet nod as if saying, "Now you get it." Standing there, watching this girl who carried a forgotten world while rebuilding a car, Richard felt something stir. It wasn't pity or corporate gain. It was respect, the kind that demanded action. He knew he couldn't just admire Emma from a distance. The world needed to see her talent. But first, he had to earn her trust, and Frank's, who had kept this prodigy hidden in a forgotten garage. For the first time, Richard Miller wanted to act not for profit, but because it felt right. The following week, Richard sat in his office, the Detroit skyline behind him, but his mind was miles away, stuck in a small, oil-stained garage where an 8-year-old had outdone his engineering team. His assistant had just dropped a stack of reports on his desk, summaries of recent projects filled with charts, cost breakdowns, and forecasts. None of it mattered, not after Emma. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, a rare doubt creeping in. If Emma's work on the Mustang was a fluke, this fixation was foolish. But Richard had built an empire on instinct, and his gut told him this wasn't luck. Emma Blake was the real deal. The idea had been brewing for days, now urgent. His company held an annual private contest, a tough challenge where engineers tackled complex automotive issues under tight rules. It was meant for senior staff, but Richard was ready to break protocol. He drove to the garage that afternoon, skipping meetings and ignoring calls. Emma was there, perched on a stool, scribbling on a greasy notepad. Frank looked up as Richard entered, not surprised. "I have an offer," Richard said, cutting to the chase. "My company has a competition for engineers, but I want you in it." He looked at Emma, but spoke to Frank too. Emma's nose wrinkled. "A competition? Like a race?" "Not quite," Richard smiled. "More like solving tough problems. A game, really." Frank's face hardened. He didn't like it, and Richard felt the tension. "You trying to show her off for your investors?" Frank asked, his tone sharp. Richard shook his head. "No cameras, no press. Just a room, tools, and a problem to solve. If she doesn't want it, I won't bring it up again." His voice was calm but urgent. He needed them to see this wasn't a stunt. Emma's eyes narrowed. Curiosity sparked. "What kind of problem?" Richard grinned. "The kind no one's cracked for months." Frank sighed, rubbing his face as if the world rested in his hands. After a long pause, he looked at Emma. "Your call, kid." Emma grinned, defiance in her eyes. "I'll do it." The next day, Richard brought them to the company's engineering lab, a sleek, sterile contrast to their garage. Lab-coated staff paused to stare at the odd trio. The head of R&D, Daniel Crow, a polished man in a sharp suit, approached with a forced smile. "Richard, this is irregular," he said, eyeing Emma with subtle contempt. "We have rules." "I'm aware," Richard cut in. "She's my guest, and she's here to tackle the intake optimization challenge your team couldn't solve." Murmurs spread through the lab. The issue was a stubborn airflow flaw in their latest engine prototype. Dozens of engineers had failed at it, yet here was an 8-year-old in red coveralls, stepping up like it was a school project. Emma was unfazed. She walked to the workstation, scanning the blueprints on the screen. The room watched, expecting her to falter, but within minutes, she pointed at a diagram section. "You're choking it," she said simply. "The curves here and here make the air fight itself. It's like breathing through a twisted straw." Engineers exchanged skeptical looks, but Richard stayed silent, watching. Emma didn't wait for approval. She grabbed a tablet, tweaked the design, then directed a stunned technician to help her 3D print a revised part. Within 2 hours, she held a prototype. The test ran that afternoon. As results flashed on the screen, the room fell silent. Efficiency had risen by 13%, a breakthrough they'd chased for nearly a year. Daniel Crowe stood frozen, his face pale. Richard turned to him, his smile sharp. "You mentioned protocols." Emma, unaware of corporate tensions, wiped her hands and asked for a sandwich. She was hungry. "More shadows. If they want a revolution, we'll give them one." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're putting a kid in front of your board?" "She's not a kid," Richard said, watching Emma adjust her sketch. "She's a mechanic, and it's time they know her name." Frank looked at Emma, then back at Richard. For the first time, there was no doubt in his eyes, just a quiet nod. The boardroom at Miller Automotive was a sleek temple of glass and steel where power hummed through polished tables and shone in designer cufflinks. Richard had ruled that table for years, mastering control. But today, the air crackled. Not with nerves, but with the thrill of a man ready to rewrite the rules in front of those who thought they owned them. The night before, Richard had decided, no more quiet deals or hidden promises. Emma Blake's revolution wouldn't stay in a lab. She'd shine on their biggest stage, the company's annual innovation showcase, broadcast live to industry leaders, investors, and the media's sharp eyes. That morning, the building hummed with unease. Word had spread that Richard was planning something wild, corporate code for "he's lost it." The PR team scrambled for damage control. Board members whispered in glass offices like nervous traders. But Richard was steady. He knew real change didn't come politely. Sometimes you had to break the door down. Emma and Frank arrived quietly, unnoticed among the suited crowd. Emma wore her faded red coveralls, grey t-shirt and simple braid, looking out of place in this polished world, yet more real than anyone else. Frank carried himself like a man who knew when a room was about to shake. Richard met them backstage, crouching to Emma's level, his voice soft but firm. "You don't need to impress them. Just do what you do. Fix the problem." Emma nodded, clutching a small drive with her prototype design, refined with Frank over the past week. A new airflow system for their electric engine, not just an upgrade, but a game-changer. On stage, the event began with polished speeches and safe ideas. Daniel Crowe stood at the podium, delivering a dull presentation of buzzwords to calm investors. Richard waited in the shadows. When Crowe reached his final slide, Richard stepped forward, cutting through the applause like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice warm but commanding. "One more demonstration, not on the program." Crowe's jaw tightened, his face like stone. The audience stirred as Richard gestured to the stage. Emma walked out, small under the bright lights, but her steps were sure. She carried no corporate anxiety, approaching the podium like it was hers. "This is Emma Blake," Richard said, his voice filling the hall. "She's 8, and she's solved what our RD team couldn't for months." Silence fell, the screens lighting up with Emma's design. She didn't give a polished speech. Pointing at the diagram, she said plainly, "Your engine's airflow is off. It's choking itself here. We rebuilt it. Let it breathe right." Her simple words hid the brilliance of her work. Engineers in the audience leaned forward, their doubt cracking as they saw the solution's elegance. Richard expected pushback, but what came was curiosity. The numbers spoke. 14% efficiency gain, lower production costs, cleaner emissions. Crowe tried to challenge, questioning a child's role in corporate RD, but his words fell flat. Emma, unfazed, asked, "Did you fix it?" The question lingered, simple and crushing. The audience, once detached, was now hooked. Investors woke up. The media found their headline: Miller Automotive's secret weapon, an 8-year-old mechanic. Richard didn't need to say more. Emma's work spoke louder. He glanced at Crowe, whose power was unraveling. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a takeover. The event ended, with Emma earning a standing ovation, though she seemed unbothered. She'd fixed the problem. That was enough. Backstage, as the board scrambled and PR teams planned, Richard, Frank, and Emma sat quietly. Frank gave Richard a half-amused, half-stunned look. "You started a war, you know." Richard smiled, eyes hard. "Let them come." Emma, holding the drive that changed the company, looked up. "What now?" Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "Now, Emma, we build something unbreakable." The days after the presentation were a storm. What began as a quiet act of defiance in a dusty garage became headlines, boardroom fights, and a wave of attention Emma and Frank never sought. The story of an 8-year-old outsmarting a top auto company was irresistible. Interview requests flooded in, offers poured, and Miller Automotive's struggling stock soared. But Richard wasn't chasing media buzz. He knew how fast admiration could turn to exploitation. Emma's work was more than a viral hit, it was a spark for industry change. He didn't want her talent lost in headlines. He wanted it to build something new. On a quiet morning away from cameras, Richard took Frank and Emma to a vast, half-empty factory on the city's edge, a relic of Detroit's prime, now hollow. Emma's eyes sparkled as they entered, the air thick with iron and dust, her kind of home. Frank walked slowly, as if feeling the place's pulse. "This is where we begin," Richard said, his voice echoing. "Not a factory, not a corporate office. A workshop where people like you, Emma, can work without rules stifling creativity. A place to learn, build, create. We'll call it Blake Motors." Frank looked at Richard, skeptical but hopeful. "You're talking revolution, Richard. This isn't just cars anymore." "I know," Richard said, calm but firm. "I'm done playing safe. You saw what they did to you. They'll keep targeting Emma unless we rebuild the system." Emma, tracing old machines, turned to the "Monsieur, if we're fixing it, we need the right tools and people." That afternoon in a dusty office once used by a forgotten manager, they talked, not about boards or investors, but kids. Richard wanted Blake Motors to hire young people like Emma, kids from shelters, foster care, written off by society, but burning with her fire. A place where their ideas shaped products. Frank listened, hands clasped, glancing at Emma. "It'll be tough," he said. "Turning outcasts into innovators? The system's not built for that." "Then we build a new one," Richard said. The project grew fast. Richard's reputation and Emma's viral success drew allies. Engineers tired of corporate limits, designers craving real problems, donors wanting authenticity. Machines were salvaged, equipment repaired. Within months, Blake Motors was alive. Emma was everywhere, not a mascot but a worker, teaching her blunt, precise way. She didn't care about age or titles, only if you could fix what was in front of you. Her hands stayed greasy, her coveralls never clean, and people respected her because she outshone them. Frank became the heart, mentoring with decades of wisdom, letting young minds lead. "You don't teach innovation," he'd say. "You let it teach you." Not everyone approved. Displaced executives whispered sabotage, blocked supplies, spread rumors of Blake Motors' doom. But each attack strengthened the workshop's resolve. Richard, once obsessed with control, thrived in the chaos. He wasn't managing image, he was building something real. The first Blake Motors prototype wasn't a flashy car, but a rugged electric utility vehicle for city crews, efficient, durable, easy to repair. Each carried a plate with the team's names, Emma's idea. "People should know who built their car," she said. The first fleet sold out before production started, orders flooding in. Blake Motors wasn't just selling vehicles, it was selling a story of overlooked kids, old mechanics, and a girl who turned a dare into a revolution. One evening, as the sun set, Richard stood on the workshop's mezzanine, watching Emma and new recruits argue over a motor design. Frank sat nearby, offering gruff corrections, but letting the kids lead. Richard saw it. This mess of voices, ideas, stubborn grit was true innovation, not boardrooms or press releases, but a workshop of people who refused to be underestimated. Blake Motors was a movement, just beginning. The old garage hadn't changed much. Its cracked floors still held oil stains, walls cluttered with tools only Frank and Emma understood. The Mustang, Emma's Mustang, sat proudly in the center, gleaming under flickering light. Yet the world outside had shifted. A year since Emma silenced a corporate stage, Blake Motors had grown from a whispered idea to an industry disruptor. Proof of what happens when you trust the overlooked. Today wasn't about designs or targets. It was about home. Richard stood at the garage entrance, watching Emma polish the Mustang's hood with ritual care. Still tiny in her red coveralls, hands always greasy, her face calm. Frank sat on a stool, Kane by the workbench, a satisfied grin on his lips. "Can't leave it alone, can you?" Richard said, his voice light, throat tight. Emma smirked. "She earned it. She's why we're here." Richard nodded. That car was more than metal. It was the start. They spent the afternoon in the garage, not as CEO, mechanic, or mentor, but family. Emma and Frank shared tales of early days when keeping the lights on was a win. Richard listened, correcting Frank's wilder stories, never interrupting Emma. Her words commanded without demanding. As dusk fell, Richard suggested driving the Mustang. It wasn't a request, a need. Emma hadn't driven it since fixing it. The car a symbol too precious to touch, but symbols, Richard thought, should move. Frank handed Emma the keys, his eyes shining with pride no boardroom could match. "Go on, kid. See if she remembers the road." Detroit streets welcomed them, familiar to those who knew its scars. The Mustang rumbled, drawing stares not for its make, but its driver. Emma, focused and serene, drove as Richard sat shotgun, happy to let go. They wove through the city without a destination, the Mustang an old soul with a new heart, like its driver. Every turn, every engine purr, showed how far they'd come. Blake Motors had signed its first global deal, spreading their model overseas. Cities once skeptical now wanted their own Blake workshops. But none of that matched this moment, the engine's hum, tires on asphalt, the quiet bond of three who refused to be statistics. They stopped on a hill overlooking the city. The skyline glowed, but the real beauty was in the shadowed factories where Emma's movement began. Frank leaned on the car, Kane firm, while Emma sat on the hood, legs swinging, watching the horizon. Richard stood, hands in pockets, a rare calm settling over him. "They'll call you a genius, an icon," he said quietly. "They'll write stories like they found you." Emma shrugged. "Let them. We'll keep building." Frank's rough laugh filled the air. "That's my girl." Richard looked at them, the weight of their fight giving way to warmth. It wasn't victory. It was belonging. For a man built on control, it was humbling. His place wasn't in a glass tower, but a garage of rust and heart. As night fell, they climbed back into the Mustang. Emma started the engine, its growl filling the quiet. Richard glanced at her, her hands steady on the wheel. She wasn't a prodigy or disruptor, just Emma Blake, the mechanic who fixed a Mustang, and without knowing fixed him too. They drove into the night, the city a canvas, not a battlefield. Challenges lay ahead, but it didn't matter. They weren't just building cars, they were building a future where no one was viewed, underestimated for their roots or small hands. The Mustang roared into the dark, reborn by a girl who taught giants to dream again. Under the stars, they weren't a CEO, mechanic, or old man. They were family, just getting started.